Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deirdre Anderson, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society. Welcome to the Hingham Heritage Museum. Today is the second of our 7-part lecture series, which will last through this academic year, and we are very thrilled that this room is full and we are officially sold out. So thanks for being part of our big day. I'd like to thank the Hingham Historical Society Board of Directors, especially Eileen McIntyre and Elizabeth Danis, who put this lecture series together with the Education Committee. I grew up on Old Colony Road as Deirdre Kavanaugh, and I went to school with Keith German and Nancy Ruffini and David and John Zona and Peter Barbuto, and the list goes on. And we had happy days at East School and Central Junior and on to Hingham High School. So it is a real thrill to see so many familiar faces back here in the audience. And it is an especially thrill to welcome you here to this beautiful building that many of you know, but probably have not been in since it's been beautifully renovated. We reopened in 2017 as the Hingham Heritage Museum at Old Derby Academy. And we have never looked back, and it's a perfect case of if you build it, they will come. We've had programming every weekend. We have wonderful momentum in the community, and I invite you all to please join us. The Hingham Historical Society, well, it has a very fancy name and a very beautiful logo, illustrated by W.A. Dwiggins in the early part of the 20th century, is not a club. It is not a private society. It is open and welcome to all who want to join and learn more about Hingham history. And as we say, if you know Hingham history, you know American history. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Danis, who will introduce today's speaker. Thanks.
Well, welcome to Hingham's Italian Immigrant Community, a panel presentation. The organizer of today's program is Eileen McIntyre. Eileen moved to Hingham from New York City in 2000. She and her husband, journalist and author Roy Harris, are empty nesters in the World's End neighborhood. Before retiring in 2015, after a long career in advertising and corporate communications, Eileen was VP of Investor Relations for Cubist Pharmaceuticals in Lexington. She is on the board of the Hingham Historical Society, chair of the board of the Hingham Land Conservation Trust, a member of the board of Friends of Old Church, and a member of the steering committee of the League of Women Voters of Hingham. She and her husband are trustees and each a former board president of the Atlantic Symphony Orchestra. Eileen received her MS in broadcast journalism from Boston University and her BA cum laude in philosophy from Newton College of the Sacred Heart. Eileen's interest in local history has been demonstrated in her initiation and management of the Hingham's Heritage Google Map Project, which is an 8-layer map launched on the Hingham Historical Society's website in 2017, and her ongoing work as co-chair of the Education Committee. As co-chair, Eileen has taken the lead in planning Waves of Change, our lecture series for 2019-2020. Our committee is very appreciative for Eileen's enthusiasm, her leadership, and her hard work. It is with great pleasure I present Eileen McIntyre.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction, quite unexpected. And thank you all for your interest in this program, one of 2 of the Waves of Change lectures that looks at contributions of 20th century immigrants to the South Shore and specifically to Hingham. Today, our focus is Hingham's Italian immigrant community. Here's what we're going to cover in what we expect will be about a 90-minute program, including questions and answers. First, we'll look quickly at some background on the waves of mid-19th to mid-20th century immigration to the Boston area. Then we'll turn our attention to the Southern Italian immigrants of the late 19th and early 20th century, the drivers for their emigration, and a little bit about their experience as they arrived in Boston. Next, we'll examine what attracted Italian immigrants to Hingham. I will then introduce our wonderful panel of descendants of 4 of these immigrants, and we'll talk about their Italian immigrant ancestors who settled in Hingham. This slide shows across a 100-year period the percentage of the population that was born outside of the US. The top line in red is for Boston. The next line down in yellow is for Massachusetts. And the bottom line of the graph in blue is for the US as a whole. If you look at the peak of that red line, that's 1910 or so, that was really the peak of the Southern Italian immigration to the Boston area. And it's 36% of the population had been born outside of the US, of the population of Boston at that time. A really stunning figure. And you can see we're climbing up again. There was a dip with World War I, and then there was some lawmaking that discouraged people to come to the US, and you see that long slide, and then it started to climb up again. But we're nowhere near the peak that we saw in those early years of the 20th century. Between 1880 and 1920, about 4.2 million Italians came to America, and 80% of those were from southern Italy. So why were southern Italians leaving the land of their birth at this time? As detailed on this slide, there were several reasons. First was a period of widespread disease in southern Italy. Cholera and malaria spreading easily in poor agricultural communities in the south. There were crop failures that made the situation worse. Political change was another reason. We think of Italy as this long, tall boot, but that was a fairly modern configuration of the nation state of Italy. There had been a number of kingdoms. There was a lot of warfare over a period of time. It was only in 1870 that shape as a nation state came into existence. So there was a lot of political tumult at the end of the 19th century, especially for the island of Sicily and the southern mainland, including the region known as Calabria, and we'll hear a lot about Calabria today. So natural disasters also plagued southern Italy, and there was a lot of activity in the late 19th and early 20th century. Here you see a shot of Mount Etna on Sicily and some of the eruptions that were significant during this time period. Here is Mount Vesuvius, which was constantly erupting, just showering lava over Naples during this period of time. Another disaster I knew nothing about before I began my research for this program, and we'll hear about a family who was directly impacted by this. The earthquake and tsunami in 1908 that destroyed much of Messina on the coast of Sicily, as well as the larger city of Reggio Calabria on the mainland across the Strait of Messina. And you see these numbers of deaths here, around 80,000 people. That was largely because of the tsunami. They didn't have the kind of monitors they have today, and even now with monitors, people die in large numbers. But compare the magnitude of the earthquake with what we're more familiar with, the San Francisco earthquake that happened 2 years before. It was a more significant earthquake in terms of magnitude, but far fewer deaths, about 3,000 deaths in San Francisco. So the tsunami was a real killer, and we'll hear more about what happened to one family as a result of this. As you likely know, Italian immigrants arriving in Boston often first settled in tenements of the North End. What you may not know is that the North End was earlier home to Italian immigrants who were part of an earlier wave, although those waves of Irish continued. But the North End was not always Italian. The immigrants generally arrived eager for work, but with little skills. They would first get pick and shovel jobs. And these photos here show some excavation work on Summer Street. It is very likely that this is for the subway system. The first Boston subway was being built in 1897, so there was a lot of subway work going on in the early part of the 20th century. Many immigrants at this time found work through a person known as a padrone. Padrones were basically middlemen between immigrants who did not know the language, didn't know how to find work, and employers. Often they were large employers such as quarry or mine operators. And padrones also found work for major infrastructure projects, whether they were private or public, electric, water projects, things like that. This is a story about someone who almost certainly was met by a padrone as he got off the boat with his wife at Ellis Island. And it's a familiar name to those of you from the Italian community in Hingham, Luigi Amonti. I chose this record from Pennsylvania, the Mahoning Township in the hills of Pennsylvania, because it shows a very large community of Italian immigrant workers who were living in housing provided by a limestone quarry, one of several in the area. And if you page through these census records, page after page after page, everyone is from Italy, has recently arrived, and there are multiple limestone quarries in this area. Luigi had arrived with his wife Marie in 1909, and why I'm suspicious that they must have been met immediately by a padrone on the dock and directed to the train to Pennsylvania is that because a year later, 1910, the census record, Luigi is now working for this limestone quarry, and they already have a daughter who was born in Pennsylvania. They may have known while they were there some of the Argiro family, because a number of members of the Argiro family also worked in not only the limestone quarries, but also the steel mills in this part of Pennsylvania. Many of them stayed for their whole lives, but some Argiros later came to Hingham as well. By 1914, the Amontis, who by then also have a son, have moved to Hingham. They were very likely part of a group of Italians who moved to Hingham together in 1913 from mines and quarries in Pennsylvania, according to the 1993 book that some of you know, Not All Is Changed. Another word here about the Padrone system before we shift our attention to Hingham. This form of sponsorship helped Italians and other immigrant groups to quickly find jobs. However, the system could cause problems. The Padrone was a powerful person who controlled jobs, who controlled your living circumstances, your ability to clothe yourself and feed yourself. And this was a vulnerable population of immigrants, many of whom didn't yet speak English. The Padrone system would start to die out when World War I interrupted immigration. So it had pluses and minuses. And now let's think about Hingham. We can understand why large mining operations, such as those in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, coal mines, steel mills, and limestone quarries needed a lot of immigrant labor. Infrastructure projects in Boston, like the subway. But what would provide lots of work in Hingham? Well, in the late 19th and early 20th century, this was a time of great transition in Hingham. The cottage industries that we hear about, like bucket making and shoemaking, were either dying out or moving to larger manufacturing centers. But workers were in demand for new types of jobs during the country's new Gilded Age. There were jobs in Hingham for carpenters, builders, painters, masons, construction and maintenance workers for the railroad, quarrymen and laborers to pave the roads, which really just started happening around the 1890s. Workers for the brand new water company at that time. Before that, we all got well water, if we were around at that time. And electric company projects, very early days of electric wiring in the town. And they also were hired to build out what became the U.S. Navy munitions depot along the Back River before World War I. Finally, they were farm workers and they were landscapers for private estates. The Gilded Age had produced some wealth for individuals. The South Coast was an area where they found large estates and they needed people to maintain them. So there was, as in Boston, there was a lot of pick and shovel work here in Hingham, as you can imagine from the list of jobs I just described. We don't have the names of the people in this photo. from the Historical Society archives, but they were almost certainly all immigrants, and very likely many of them were Italian. One of our local infrastructure projects at this time was the electric street railway. Shown here, it was built in 1896, ran along Main Street from Queen Anne's Corner to downtown and the waterfront, connected with another line that went to Nantasket Beach there. The street railway, like a streetcar line, would be discontinued about 1920. You're going to hear more about the revolution in transportation that Hingham experienced as we moved into the 20th century in an upcoming program in this lecture series, and I see Bob Malmy in the audience, and he's going to just dazzle you with some pictures from our archives for that. Here are some immigrant laborers using an old-fashioned version of a utility truck, stringing electric wiring for, in this case, the street trolley. Workers would also be needed, though, for the electrification of street lighting that began in 1889, and then residential electrification. The first 200 homes in Hingham were wired by 1900. Other projects making use of immigrant labor included, as I mentioned before, digging for the first water lines. Until the late 19th century, Hingham residents all used well water, and the new water company began service in 1880. Between 1901 and 1920, 50% of all the Italians that came to the US went back to Italy. Many had not come to stay, but to make money so they maybe could buy a little piece of land back in southern Italy. Well, early on, Hingham's Italian immigrant laborers were also transient, and there's a lot of words on this slide, but let me guide you through it. These were single men who came. Often a Padrone had sent word back to Calabria and places like that they needed men for a specific project. They would come over and live together, and you see here that they lived in dormitories, in encampments, in a variety of places. These are all in North and West Hingham. So there was a lot of work in this part of town for a number of the projects that I talked about before. But they were transient. So in 1895, there were 80 foreign-born Italians listed in Hingham's directory. In 1902, there are no Italians listed. But in 1908, 14 Italian families are listed. So they came for the projects, they may have moved on to another project, or they may have gone back to Italy. So here are these examples. The kinds of work that they were doing, you see for the Lane Quarry, there was an encampment, for the Navy Ammunition Depot, for street paving. So there were, can you imagine walking around downtown Hingham with workers coming and going, probably with different dialects if they came from Sicily or different parts of Calabria? It's a very different place then. So I mentioned local quarry work. Local quarries employed many Italian immigrants, and there were 3 quarries in North Hingham that provided rock and crushed stone for the roadways and for the beds for railroad tracks and other construction work. You see the pictures here of what that would have looked like with one of the quarries featured. There was John Beale's South Shore Quarries and 2 others, but in the book Not All Has Changed, they describe some of the technology that John Beale's quarries had. According to that book, the Beale quarry operation featured an endless bucket that fed material into a cylindrical sleeve which sorted the crushed rock into 4 sizes. There were rail spurs at both the Beale and the Lane quarries that then brought the crushed stone to the railroad to be transported. So it was a fairly efficient operation, but manual labor that was really, really tough. Quarry work was grinding, physically draining. Anna Terrassi Calvi, who was quoted in the book Not All Has Changed, said, "All they did was move rocks, rocks, rocks. They killed themselves working by hand." Work was generally contract work or day work. This group of laborers was photographed in downtown Hingham. The backdrop is either the streetcar barn or perhaps the freight depot, which was then located in downtown Hingham. And they may have been waiting for the day's assignments. We're not sure why the picture was taken. But if you look at the types of hats worn, we were trying to guess the other day, there's probably some Russians here as well as Italians. There's definitely some Irish. You can kind of look at the faces and try and guess what their nationality is, but almost certainly they're all immigrant laborers. One construction project was the bridge over Rockland Street for rail service to Hull. This service to Nantasket Beach was discontinued in 1932, but the abutments, one of them at least, is still there. By 1912, the Italian immigrants, who I described earlier as being transient workers, they were starting to stay in Hingham and have families. So I looked at the birth records. I just picked the year 1912, and Eileen McCracken at Town Hall was good enough to show me the birth records. And look at these familiar names that you see here, the families that are starting to have children in Hingham. This is meant to show you that there was a lot of home building going on. And it was the numbers of home structures in Hingham more than doubled during a 15-year period. It's really a tremendous period of building. This is the area that's most associated with the Italians, but they did live in different parts of Hingham. If you know where the Sons of Italy Hall is, C3A here, is Kilby Street. So that corner where the Sons of Italy Hall, that is one corner basically of the neighborhood. And you take Kilby Street over to Rockland, back here on 228, which is here Hull Street, it's in Hull, and then back here along East Street and back up again. This quadrangle, if you will, was the heart of the Italian immigrant community. And I'm going to show you some data that supports that early growth there. So this is the 1920 census. Well, it's not the whole census. I picked out a couple of streets to show you. So East Street, Hull Street, and Rockland Street are on this. And you can see all these Italian names here. So this is one portion of that neighborhood that I just showed you. Look at the kind of work that they're doing. They're working for the railroad. They're gardeners on private estates. And we got a couple of barbers, and we'll hear about one particular barber later today. A lot of laborers, though. This is Kilby Street, and this is very densely populated. Some of the data that I included on here is the size of the families, the number of children. Take a look at some of these families that are represented today. Down here, I think you see Calvi's and Galuzzo. They're having families of 6 to 8 children. So they've really settled in. One of the things that struck me in these families with one wage earner, often working contract day labor, the faith that these people had in the future to raise these families. It's really heartwarming to see and uplifting to think of the faith they had in the future. And here we have North Street. So there were also Italians on North Street. In this, I think you see some Conditos who later live on Lincoln Street. And we have 2 of our panelists today who grew up on North Street. So as the families grow, as you saw, the wives and daughters in the Italian immigrant families often find work outside the home. And one very popular employer for whom the mothers of 2 of our panelists worked was Greenfield's Knitting Mills on North Street, a business that was started by Abraham Greenfield, a Russian immigrant, and later run by his sons. I heard a lot about the joy that the women who often didn't speak English but had a feeling of community at Greenfield's, which was both a retail shop and a knitting mill. And you'll hear a little bit from one of our panelists about her mother's experience there. So this is almost wallpaper. And I created this to show you how impressive it was to see that these men who you heard earlier did nothing but move rocks, had very little education. The number of businesses started by this community is just stunning. And even as recently as I think it was Saturday when I was talking to Marianne, I added a few more. So they are restaurateurs, landscapers, specialists in the construction and building trades that often depend on the use of heavy equipment, think lots of trucks, along with barbers. And it's just a stunning list. So many of these were multi-generational family enterprises, many of them lasting for decades, and some of them existing to this day. So it's just something that I think maybe we take for granted when you think about all the heavy work that's been done for excavation, for road paving, for home construction. So much of it has been done by people who are descendants of this community. And now let's meet our 4 panelists, each of whom is a descendant of Italian immigrants who settled in Hingham. And they're going to walk up, and I'll introduce them each in turn. Panel, come on up. You're going to first hear today from Carl Achille, who's taking up the rear as they walk up in procession here. Carl, along with his wife Susan, managed Bowl and Board on North Street for 30 years. So some of you may recognize his face from years of shopping at Bowl and Board. Carl retired in 2003. Carl's in the fourth seat over there. He grew up on North Street, and Carl is the grandson of Italian immigrants George Achille and Maria Arrigo Achille. Next, Keith German. Many of you know Keith. He is a Chief Petty Officer in the U.S. Navy. He is also the current veteran agent of the town of Hingham. See him at town meeting every year. Keith is a lifelong resident of Kilby Street, and he is the great-grandson of Italian immigrants Rocco Calvi and Florence Femia Calvi. Next, we have Marianne Galuzzo Bryan. Now an assistant superintendent of schools in Weymouth, Marianne grew up on East Street in Hingham. Her immigrant ancestry includes maternal grandparents Salvatore Bravo and Carmela Freni Macauda Bravo, and paternal grandparents Giuseppe Galuzzo and Maria Vittoria Dominella Galuzzo. Finally, the wonderful Kay Zona Ruffini. Kay is a lifelong resident of Hingham. She grew up mostly on North Street. Kay has raised 6 children here and also worked for 29 years at foster school and the nurse's office. Kay's immigrant ancestry includes her paternal grandfather, Louis Zona, as well as her mother, Caterina Spano Zona, and we'll hear a wonderful story about her mother. So a large portion of Hingham's Italian immigrants came from Calabria, and others came from Sicily. Martone, over here. So Sicily is this island right off the tip. Martone in Calabria, you see that red marker there pointing here, is the town from which both Carl Achille's paternal grandfather and Keith German's maternal great-grandfather emigrated. Now we're going to hear about Carl's grandfather, George Achille. George Achille, an orphan, left as an infant on the steps of the Martone Town Hall. And he was first named Achille Talone. Achille was his first name. He was adopted into a loving home and raised in Martone. He was married when he decided to come to the U.S., first on his own to seek work. He got a job on the railroad, and his wife and firstborn son joined him in 1906. They settled first in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, where 5 more children, including the boy who would become Carl's father, were born. Achille's name has been reversed along the way to Talone Achille, but Carl's grandfather didn't like Talone as a first name, and he chose to call himself George Achille. By 1914, George and Marie have moved to Hingham in a home on Kilby Street, where the last 2 of 8 children were born. And then came the great flu pandemic of 1918-1919. George died at age 43, leaving Marie to raise their 8 children. Here you see Marie Arrigo Achille on the right with her husband before he had passed and some of their 8 children. Carl, I understand that your grandmother Marie, shown here, was a force of nature. She had been known to take charge of situations earlier in her married life. Could you tell us about how she engineered that move from Woonsocket, Rhode Island to Hingham?
Yes, I can tell you family legends that have continued on for years. As the story goes, my grandmother heard that my grandfather, who was, I believe, working for the railroad at that time in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, had been approached by the local organized crime group, or the mob, whatever you want to call them. And he had seemed to be kind of interested in joining up with them. And my grandmother, of course, had no interest in that happening at all. So one night when he came home from work, he found all of their belongings packed up, and she had train tickets and ready to go to Hingham, where friends from her original village back in Italy were living. However, as the story goes again, someone looked out the window and said, "We can't leave now, they're watching us." So whoever they were not good people. But at any rate, eventually they were able to get on the train and make it up to Hingham, and that's why they ended up here in Hingham.
And we're very happy that you're here as a result of that. So her husband's death at such a young age and such a large family must have been really devastating. Marie knew very little English, as I understand, and she had relied on the income that George provided. Yet after his death, she managed to raise the 8 children on her own. Could you tell us some of the stories about the creative ways that Marie found to support her family?
Yes, apparently she was quite creative. She was left with 8 children. Obviously, probably couldn't speak much English at all, but she did know how to use currants to make a bootleg liquor that she was able to sell to employees of the railroad. She seemed to do a lot of farming. They raised chickens, of course, and they had a garden. And there was always one pig that was butchered every year. And she liked to keep things kind of private, I guess, because any banking that she did, she would walk down the railroad tracks with 2 of the boys and do the banking in Cohasset. And not to waste that long walk to and from Cohasset, on the way back, now this is a story that I've heard virtually all my life, 2 of the boys would pick up a railroad tie and balance it on her head, and she would take it home and they would use it for fuel in the furnace. So I don't know how you can get much more resourceful than that.
And Carl, you got to know your grandmother because she lived to be 86 years old.
Yes, she did.
So do you have any favorite memories of time you spent with this determined woman?
Well, probably one of my favorite memories is that we would often go to her house on Sundays for Sunday dinner. And there was various members of the family. Some aunts and uncles would be there as well. It seemed to change every time. But I was, as a youngster, a very finicky eater. And if I didn't like the look of something, I was kind of not too interested in that. But one Sunday, she prepared chicken cacciatore, which I didn't think looked too great in the pot there, you know, all tomato sauce and little pieces of meat and so forth. But once I tasted it, that was it. And I've enjoyed it ever since. The other memory was she always seemed to have for dessert a little candy made out of heavy white sugar or something with licorice in the middle. I don't know if anyone else has ever seen that. I know it was popular at Italian wedding receptions back in the day too, that were often held at Agricultural Hall. But that's another one of my favorite memories, that candy, and I haven't been able to find it since.
So Dick Achille, your dad, grew up in this large family surrounded by other relatives in the tight-knit Italian community. As a teenager, he got a job at the Bates Farm, which is where East School is now. But a cousin then hired him to work at their Hingham greenhouse, which became a foundation for his life's work. Many in our audience will recall the Candido greenhouse on Lincoln Street. As I understand it, your dad had both a brother and a sister who married members of the Candido family. And Fred and Tony Achille had their own greenhouse on Main Street. So what are some of the memories of these Achille Candido family connections?
Well, I have nothing but great memories about the Candido family and the Achilles. My father worked for the Hingham Flower and Garden Company, which was on Lincoln Street, where Candido Road is today, if anybody's familiar with that area. He worked there for, I believe, 25 years or more. And during the war, they also did a lot of growing of vegetables and so forth behind the greenhouse, because there was room there and food was in such demand during the war. But we would often go to Frank Candido's house, who was known as the boss, for dinner. And I always enjoyed the wonderful Italian pastries that they had there. And to show you how long ago this happened, I have memories of sitting on my father's knee drinking coffee out of a saucer. So I was pretty young. But part of my father's job as a greenhouse worker was also making deliveries. And he would swing by the house often and pick me up and take me out on the truck, and we would go and make deliveries to Rhode Island or the Boston area, Quincy. And it was a lot of fun just being with my dad for that amount of time, and, you know, just whatever kids at a very young age like that can have for a conversation. But yes, two of my uncles, my uncle Rocco and Uncle Joe, married Candidos, and so it was a very well-connected family.
And here we see your dad, Dick Achille, in his role later on, managing the grounds and gardens that was what was then the Laner Estate on South Pleasant Street, which Hinghamites know well now because at town meeting we decided to acquire a good portion of that property as parkland. I know, Carl, that you have many more stories you could tell about your grandmother, as well as your dad and others, but now we're going to turn to the story of another Italian immigrant, Rocco Calvi, and his family. Like George Achille, Rocco Calvi was born in Martone, Italy, and had married before he first came to the U.S. on his own in 1902. We are not sure, but Rocco may have, like others, first worked through a padrone in the limestone quarries or coal mines or steel mills of Pennsylvania. He would travel back and forth to Italy a few times, but in 1909, Rocco's wife and 4 children join him in the U.S., and they come to Hingham. The 1910 census shows Rocco working at the Lane Quarry. Around this time, Rocco has assumed the role of a padrone, sponsoring other men from Calabria to come directly to Hingham for work. In 1918, Rocco is working at the Navy Ammunition Depot along the Back River and probably bringing workers in for that work as well. And the Calvi family is growing. Sadly, though, in 1925, Rocco is killed at age 49 when a disagreement with a neighbor ended violently. Like Marie Achille a few years earlier, Florence Femia Calvi, your great-grandmother, Keith, is left with a large family, 7 of them still living at home. Keith, I'd like to ask you first to talk about how this tight-knit community and large families like the Calvis and the Achilles pulled through in times of tragedy. We've now heard about the violent death of your great-grandfather. Earlier, we heard about the flu pandemic, which struck down several otherwise young people in the Italian neighborhood. There were also deaths due to accidents that I've heard about during my research. One young child drowning tragically after falling through ice at Foundry Pond, another being killed at a train crossing, and in more recent history, a terrible auto collision that took the lives of 2 teenagers from the Kilby Street neighborhood. So what are the characteristics of this Italian immigrant community that perhaps help at these times of tragedy?
I think that just the sense of they were coming to a new place, coming to a new country. They banded together, as you showed on the map. They stuck together and sort of formed that little enclave. And they were easily able to lean on each other for food and supplies and things when those times of tragedy that you mentioned happened. And just as a young man, I can remember growing up as a boy and that being such a free place to be. You could travel those boundaries. As long as you stayed within those boundaries, you could go out. And it was very safe and similar to what Carl said. If I didn't like what I was having for dinner, I simply just went and knocked on the neighbor's door, who was my cousin or my uncle or my aunt, and I would eat over their house, and the rules were pretty much the same. So it was very easily banded together. They stayed within their own, although they strived to be Americans. They were longing to be part of or be accepted to be American, and it was a hard journey.
So one of Rocco and Florence's sons, your grandfather, Joseph Calvi, who had emigrated with his parents from Italy, dropped out of school after his father's death to help support his mother and 6 siblings living at home. He first worked as a movie picture projectionist, working for an older brother who had a couple of movie theaters, his early days of the movies. But then he developed skills as a stonemason and started his own business. So Keith, you knew him as your grandfather, but you've also heard from your mom, Nancy Calvi, German, who's here today, about her dad's amazing skills as a stonemason and also his self-taught business savvy in spite of very little formal education. Can you share a couple of stories about your grandfather?
Sure. He absolutely had to rise to the challenge. I think in the book that you first mentioned in your monologue piece, it was quite well known that his father was a Padrone. He was considered they had a name for him too. I heard this was the boss, right? And they had the king of Kilby Street. And having that title, there was some consequences, as you mentioned. And that dispute ended poorly. He lost his life, my great-grandfather. My grandfather at the time had to step up, and he became the leader of that family. And he later, sort of in the book, it talks about he avenged that death, and he became the king of Kilby Street, and it sort of passed on. And he had a lot of responsibilities. He had a large family, many brothers and sisters, huge extended family. I can remember traveling to the North End as a kid on every Saturday with 2 big black bags that we used to have to go in and go to all the push carts, and we have to get the meat, and everybody knew him, and it was a cool thing to see that he was that well known, even outside of Hingham. So I can remember going to the motion pictures when he used to take me. I'd sit on his knee down to the Marshfield Drive-In. Many of you may remember the Marshfield Drive-In that his brother owned. And I used to see movies right from the projection booth. So I was hooked at an early age on movies. So that continues even today. So that spread a lifelong interest in motion pictures that I really enjoy. And I can remember a lot of paving with my Uncle Joe and some other relatives, my Uncle Jim and a lot of the other family members, extended family members, and we used to go out, and I used to sit on the roller. That was his job, the roller, the steam roller. So that was kind of cool. I was just a little boy, and to be able to do that, and I know when we used to travel, a lot of times he would, I can also remember him taking in families, and my grandmother would feed everybody. So there was a large calling for that. They would bring families over, they would get them settled, and then they would move on and start their own businesses. So it was a very interesting childhood to be part of that and see that all unfold. It was kind of like the movies.
While the Italian immigrant families worked really hard, as you've described with your grandfather, they didn't always feel appreciated by the broader Hingham community. And in the book, Not All Has Changed, there is a recollection provided by your grandmother, Joseph Calvi's wife, Anna Tarassi Calvi. She was born in Hull in 1906 to Italian immigrant parents and attended Hingham schools, as all of the Hull children did at the time. And she's quoted in the book saying, "The Irish wouldn't accept us. The kids would pick on us and tell us to go back to Hull. If they knew you were Italian, they'd say things like, 'Get out of the way, you.'" So what did you hear, Keith, when you were growing up about this side of the 20th century Italian experience in Hingham?
So even during that time, in my time, I can remember that I know it's commonly referred to as North Hingham. Everyone that I knew, we called it West Corner. So if you were from West Corner, you kind of knew everybody from West Corner. And again, that was that boundary line that you drew out, and it was a safe area to be. Outside of that, it was still tough to be part of a working class neighborhood in Hingham. It was hard to be growing up in that era, but it was hard on the outside, but it was so easy there. Like I said, it was very easy to live within those boundaries, and the close-knit family and just a sense of community. I can remember as a young man, so first generation, and my mother who's here in the audience, I can remember coming home for lunch if I was out on a job with my grandfather, and he'd always come home for lunch every day, and my grandmother would have lunch ready for us, and they'd be talking in Italian, and my mother would slam her hand down on the table and go, "English, ma, English." So it was funny to see that the first generation. So my mother Nancy and her brother Joe were the first, and they wanted to be Americans. They strove to be. We want to be American. We want to change everything. We want to be part of this America and be accepted. And you weren't always easily accepted, and especially them. The older generation would speak Italian. It was common for them to do that in the house and trade, barter, money. There wasn't a lot of money changing hands. There was a lot of bartering of, I'd be taken to the doctor over in Weymouth, and my grandfather would have a black bag with Swiss chard and a couple of tomatoes in there. And it was like I got seen because my tonsils were inflamed or something, and it was wild. It was wild to think about that doesn't even exist today. But very, very interesting. Very, very easy to live there at that time.
So while Joseph Calvi found time to enjoy family and friends, in spite of all his hard work, he did love family and friends. He had hobbies, I understand, that included winemaking in some hidden away part of the house. So perhaps during Prohibition he was helping out. And yet, with all of this hard work, he died at a fairly young age, at age 71. So your grandfather has now died, and you, Keith, somewhat like the experience your grandfather Joseph had when he died in 1979. You were 12 years old, and you were asked to step into a fairly adult role in the family. What was that?
So basically, my grandmother, who lived directly across the street from us, because I'm sure when my mother married an Irishman from West Hingham, my grandfather wasn't going to let her too far out of his sight, so they built a house directly across the street. And when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother really couldn't be left alone. So at that time, I was the oldest male child in that family. And I remember sleeping over there every night. I'd go home in the morning, get ready for school or whatever, get my clothes and go to school and come back every day. And they had, through connections at West Corner, picked out a job for me. And at age 13, I had just turned 13 then, went to work at Abadessa's Fine Italian Cuisine, and I was a dishwasher, and I couldn't even reach the sink. So I remember being up on a milk crate, and they, at the end of the week, and this is real, going back to that real community, that real family from the old country that they brought forward, where they all knew each other. They knew she needed help. So then they would give me an envelope, take this home to your grandmother. You know what I mean? So it was like, don't open the envelope, take that home to your grandmother. So I remember every week being paid. I remember working there working right up through the ranks. I started at 13 and I left at 18 to join the Navy, but I stayed in that restaurant from when it was down West Corner to when it moved to where probably a lot of people know, the old Friendlies on Lincoln Street. And I had stayed there my whole time and went from dishwasher to line cook before I left for the Navy. And portions of that money I remember giving her in an envelope. And the Abadessa family was, connected. I was always told they were our cousins, but then George, Achilles are my cousins. Everyone's my cousin. So it was hard to figure out who was who, but it worked. They made it work.
So you spent a lot of time with your grandmother, Anna Taurasi Calvi, and as we've already heard, Anna contributed a lot of recollections to the book, Not All Has Changed, about the Kilby Street neighborhood. She was honored for this and her other contributions to Hingham by being named Grand Marshal of the 4th of July Parade in 1987. Now, Anna lived to age 96 and a half, so she got to see a couple of generations of the family grow up. Is there a story or memory about your grandmother that you'd like to share, Keith?
I think two of the most amazing stories that I can remember were at age 90, she had flown for the first time on an airplane. So she was born before air travel was even invented. So she had no desire to get on an airplane, but then realized that I couldn't just throw her in the car and take her to my mother, who now had moved to Florida, every time she wanted to go down there. So I remember we put her on a plane for the first time, and still the times where the pilot used to come out and pin the plastic wings on kids, and they found out that she was 90 years old and never been on an aircraft, and he came out and they made a huge big deal about it. And yeah, so that was kind of neat, and it was kind of amazing for me to see that, because I had that in my life. She went from 1906 to almost to 2000, and just the amount of change that she saw just is baffling to my mind. But the other great story that comes to my mind is her being named as that Grand Marshal, because I remember her being interviewed, similar to you interviewing me for your presentation here. She was interviewed for that book, and there's many quotes in that book, many stories that she told that author. And I think one of the most famous things that she did was she became that Grand Marshal of the parade. So that dream of being accepted, of being a real American, finally came true. And that was probably the biggest highlight of her life was being in the 4th of July parade and being that citizen who was the Grand Marshal. I think the dream finally came together for them.
Great. Thank you, Keith. And now we're going to hear about Dominic Galuzzo. He was born here on East Street in Hingham in 1910. Two Italian immigrants who were from Guarderia in Calabria. So Joseph Galuzzo and Maria Dominelli Galuzzo were his parents. His younger brother, Salvatore, was born 2 years later. And when the boys were quite young, their mother died. The boys were sent to live with their mother's brother and his wife, we believe, on Kilby Street. They were quite unhappy there, and at that point his father had remarried, but after a young son from this new marriage was killed at a railroad crossing, the father fell into such a deep depression that he was institutionalized. So these two young boys were living with an uncle, quite unhappy. Dominic made a plan to make a life for himself and his brother, and as a young man, he first found work as a gardener, soon started his own landscaping business, and employed his brother Sal. He rents and then later purchases what had been his parents' home on East Street, with room for his brother Sal to live there. He married by the time he was 27, and at age 30, he and his wife, Marianne Makauda Galuzzo, have started their own family. And it's here at 110 East Street that our panelist, Marianne Galuzzo Bryan, grows up. Marianne, did your dad ever talk about those early years when he left his uncle's house and was getting started with his landscaping business?
So I'm the youngest of 7 children, and there's 19 years between the oldest and myself. So my dad's business had grown and he had been in business for a long time. So he did not really speak too much about starting his business, but he made it very, very clear how important work ethic was and working hard, as well as family and taking care of your family and each other. So his business provided that to us, and he made that a very, very strong impression on all of us.
So as your dad's business grew, he became active in the community, and he was one of the founders of the local Sons of Italy Lodge. And with the help of a few of our panelists, I've been able to identify, 4 members of the Sons of Italy in this picture here. Some of you in the audience may recognize others. The Sons of Italy first met at a place that was the Oddfellows Hall, a former Universalist meeting house at 196 North Street, which is now a private home. But Dominic was instrumental in creating a new home for the Sons of Italy in Hingham. In the late 1950s, a structure that had been a firehouse in Hingham was acquired and moved to a parcel of land at the corner of Kilby Street and then modified and expanded. And that is the Sons of Italy Hall that stands there today. So you see right there, thanks to Jerry Duff and her work on the archives, we have a picture of that firehouse as it's about to move. Jerry reported that there was actually a fire in the structure as they were about to move it, so they almost lost it. But they were able to move it. So Marianne, can you talk a little bit about your father's role in the larger community, the Sons of Italy and many other things?
Yes, so my dad loved Hingham, and he was part of not only starting the Sons of Italy, but my recollection of the Hingham Skating Club, where he was a landscape gardener. In the wintertime, they were pretty quiet unless it snowed, and he felt that it was important to give back to the community, and I think just like your family, wanted to be part of the larger community. He was very proud to be Italian, but he wanted to be American as well. So he helped found that and the Hingham Bathing Beach. So with many of the other businessmen in town, because they were all associated through the Rotary and through the kinship, they all got together and tried to make this the very best place that they could. And he was very proud of that. Finally, he ran for office as the Tree and Park Commissioner. And in his later years, he was Tree and Park Commissioner for a very long time and was proud of that as well.
And you said that you could drive along the streets and he would tell you all about the trees that you passed?
He could tell you about every tree in town and the ones that were pruned incorrectly as we'd go down the street as well.
So we'll turn now to the story of your mom's family. And here we come back to the great flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. On the left, I show a picture. For those of you who are interested, this is quite an interesting story of how this went through the country. And this pandemic would reshape the family in which your mom grew up. So this is a diagram I'm going to take you through. So your maternal grandmother, Carmela Freni Macauda, first of all, was born in Messina in 1895 in Sicily. We heard about the Messina earthquake and tsunami. Well, she had emigrated in 1909, just a year after that earthquake. First lived in Boston, where she met her first husband, Italian immigrant Salvatore Macauda, a laborer, very possibly a mason, which is what his father did. They had moved to Hingham a few years before the flu pandemic hit, but Salvatore was one of the victims of that flu, and he died shortly before his 36th birthday. Carmela was left with 3 daughters under the age of 5. At the same time, on the right of this, Rocco Bravo was living in Boston, working at a chocolate factory in Roxbury. There was a lot of chocolate manufacturing going on in Boston. I recently happened to read about, pretty interesting. But he was working there when his wife died. We don't have her death certificate, but the timing suggests it was also due to the flu. Rocco was also left with 3 daughters to raise on his own. And it's not clear how Carmela met Rocco, but when they did, they quickly joined forces and moved into a home in Hingham. Before long, there were 4 more children. So they have three daughters, and now 4 more. And then the Depression hit. So Marianne, your mother was part of such a large family at a time of great economic challenge with the Depression. I understand that she dropped out of school to help out. Tell us about that.
Right, so I just want to clarify. So I don't know how I missed this, but my mom was Mary Macauda. But there was also Mary Bravo. Oh, so yes. Salvatore Macauda is my grandfather. Rocco Bravo is my maternal step-grandfather.
Right, so I misspoke about your relationship, yes.
There's so many Marys.
Yeah, so your mother is one of these children.
Right, one of the
from
3.
Your mother's first marriage.
Yes,
Thanks
my grandmother's. Yep,
that.
absolutely. Yeah. So my mom loved going to school, and unfortunately, in 8th grade, she had to drop out of school. My dad made it to 6th grade, but with that many children, she was asked to go to work, at which point she used the skills that my grandmother taught her and was able to get a job at Greenfields or Sweaterville, USA, at which point she was a very strong woman and very skilled, so they made her the forelady of Sweaterville and the pattern maker. And she told many, many stories about how much she loved being there and the camaraderie that you spoke of the Italian women there. She was a pretty strict person. And from what we were told, once she left, they put in a time clock, because if you were late for work, my mother made sure that that was noted, and there was no time clock needed when she was there. But she had a wonderful, wonderful relationship with the Greenfields and spoke very, very highly of them and the opportunities she was given by working at Sweaterville at that time in her life. She loved it.
So clearly the Bravo family made things work with this large combined family. And here's a picture from 1945 of one of the daughters, Helen Bravo's wedding, with several sisters and brothers, or half-sisters and half-brothers, as part of this wedding party. You see Rocco there. Marianne and I were discussing the other day, why is her mother not in the picture? And we believe it's probably because she wasn't formally part of the wedding party, because her husband would have walked the bride down the aisle. The mothers didn't always get the same attention in the wedding party as such. But what a lovely, happy picture when you think of all the tragedy behind the history of this family, to see these healthy, happy people that emerge. It's wonderful. So now we're going to turn to the Zona family, and specifically to Caterina Spano, who became part of the Zona family by marriage. And that's the mother of our panelist, Kay Zona Ruffini. Earlier, I mentioned the 1908 earthquake and tsunami that caused such destruction in Messina along the coast of Sicily. Caterina was just 3 years old when the building that her family lived in was destroyed by the cataclysmic event. Caterina's parents and a sister died, but Caterina and her brother were pulled from the rubble. They were then raised in gender-specific orphanages. A lot of international relief agencies came into this devastated area, set up orphanages, and that's where she was raised. For Caterina, the girls in the orphanage really became her family. She referred to them, I understand, as her sisters. And the Russian woman who ran the Casa Familia Regina Elena orphanage, Sophia Edelson, was quite loving, as I've heard from Kay. Caterina would spend 20 years at the orphanage. Kay, first, I'm wondering, did your mother ever mention memories of the earthquake?
Yes, as I'm looking at the pictures, she always said that she can remember sitting on the ledge of one of those houses that have toppled over. She and her brother were sitting there with their feet just dangling on the other side of the house. And also, all she can remember as she tells the story is she's looking down at 3 years old. She could remember this. Looking down under the ground, she can remember arms and legs sticking out of the ground from that. And that's the only thing that she can remember of it.
So the girls at the orphanage supported themselves and the orphanage with needlecraft, including this example, this beautiful bedspread. And we'll hear more about this particular beautiful piece of Messina needlecraft in a minute. But first, we're going to have a little background on Kay's dad, Giovanni or John Zona. So John was actually born in the U.S. in 1906 to Italian immigrant parents in Somerville, Massachusetts, where his dad worked as a barber. But when John was just a baby, his parents returned to Messina. His parents would then separate for some reason, we don't know exactly. His father would come back a few years later to the U.S. with the older children. But John, the youngest, was left behind and was primarily raised by his maternal grandmother. Time passes, and as a teenager, John decides he wants to come to the U.S. and reacquaint himself with his big sisters and brothers and his dad. He had worked in a bakery in Messina, so he first found work at Montillo's Bakery in Boston. But then he decided to study to be a barber, which is what his dad did for a living. So after he studied to be a barber, got a job, he decided it was time for him to marry, and of course, he wanted to go back to Messina to find an Italian bride. So, Kay, I know that the beautiful bedspread we just saw played a role in how your parents met. Can you tell us this lovely story?
Well, my mom was in the orphanage until she was 28 years old. And then when Dad decided, after coming to America, He came to America when he was 19 years old. He had never seen or met his siblings, so he became reunited with them again up on Turkey Hill in Hingham. How they landed in Hingham to begin with, I don't even know. I just encourage most people to ask questions while you're young and your parents are living, because there are a lot of things we don't know. I wish we could ask questions because they're all gone. But anyway, after being in America, he came to America when he was 19 years old, and he lived with one of his sisters who had married. So in the meantime, he worked in Montelius in Quincy, or Boston, I guess it was at the time. Decided he didn't like that at all. But living with an uncle, a brother-in-law, who was a barber, encouraged him to become a barber. So he went to barber school and became a barber. So after he was 23 years old, he decided he wanted to get married. So he decided to go to Italy and reacquaint with some of his old friends that he had left when he was 19 years old. So when he got there, he knew one of his friends, and he explained to him that he wanted to get married. This is a cute story. So when he got there, his friend said to him, well, I have an idea. There's an orphanage, and they have a little store where they sell the things that the children have learned in the stitchery. And we're going to go in there and say, you want to buy something? And when you do look at the article she's showing you, if you think you like her, and you're interested in meeting her or knowing her, just say, yes, I like it, if you like her. If you think you don't like her, say, no, I don't like it. But my mother keeps saying to me, every time I show this thing, he wasn't looking at the article, he was looking at me saying, yes, I like it. Yes, I like it. So as a result, they ended up courting in the orphanage. He would sit on one side of the room and she would sit on the other side of the room, and they had a chaperone going up and down the hall, making sure there's no hanky-panky going on. Well, they ended up getting married about 6 to 8 months later, and that's how I started. They came to America, and I was born right after that.
So I believe in this photograph here, one of the women is Sophia from the orphanage? Is that
Yes,
Sophia there?
on the left-hand side.
Right, and then that's
And
John's
my
mother.
maternal grandmother is on the right-hand
Right.
side.
Right.
And they were both 23 years old.
Yeah. Just lovely old pictures. I'm so glad that you shared those with us. So they moved to Hingham, and John establishes himself as a barber. Here you see him, as his father had as well elsewhere in Hingham. And eventually John bought what was a pretty run-down building on North Street. Now, this is a very wet area of town at the time, so buildings didn't last a long time. So he got a fixer-upper and made it both a family home and a barbershop. So Kay, you were born in 1930, as the Depression was just beginning.
Right.
And with your younger twin brothers, you grew up on North Street most of your life in the building your dad had remodeled. These were pretty challenging economic times. I know at one point your dad left the barbershop, wasn't making enough income, but then was working at the World War II shipyard.
Yes, dear.
Your mom's sewing skills must have come in handy as well. So tell me about what your mother would have done.
She was a great stitcher, just from the orphanage and what she learned there. And while he was in the shipyard, he used to work for, I don't think anybody could remember, down in Hingham Square. Hingham Square was downtown where St. Paul's Church is. We call Hingham Center, where the drugstore is up in there and the bank is up there now. But she worked for Williams Limited. That was a store that used to be in Hingham Square a long time ago. And they used to make draperies, line draperies, and my mother worked for them. And that's how I learned to sew from there, too. And while he was in the shipyard, this is what happened. And she kept things going for us. She was a wonderful woman.
And she didn't speak much English, like many other...
No, when my mother and father were married, I only understood Italian. I never spoke the language at all. I don't even know how I began to learn English. I think it's until I started going to school. Mm-hmm. But I never spoke Italian the whole time that they were, while I was young, until I started going to school. Never spoke to them in Italian. And they spoke the dialect.
And that would have been the Sicilian dialect, so different from other
Yes,
Italians in
yes.
town,
The
perhaps.
Sicilian dialect is different from some of the other dialects.
And your mom also worked at Greenfield?
Yes,
Mill?
just like Mary Ann's mother. She wasn't the boss though, but your mother must have been the boss to her.
Yeah, I think
But I
so.
can remember being at West School up on Thaxter Street, and I would come down Thaxter Street, and there always would be a policeman there guiding us across the street, and I'd go around the building where Greenfields was, and I knew where my mother sat on the window. Her machine was right at the window, and I would wave to her. And like Mary Ann said, they were a great family. They were loved working together. I met all the Galuzzos and all the rest of the people, Bravos and everybody who worked in Greenfields. It was a wonderful, wonderful community.
You talked about walking home from school. So you grew up in downtown Hingham, pretty much, or some would call that part of North Street, West Hingham. But it was a time before a lot of change. So the Mill Pond was not going to be filled in until 1953. So there's still a lot of water around. There was the old Colony Railroad service to downtown until 1959. So very different streetscape. But what was your life like as a young girl living in the downtown neighborhood?
One thing I can remember, we moved in, our house was still on stilts. And every time the town brook would overflow, the whole backyard, I don't know if you remember that, would just fill with what was like a pond. And I can remember the Wise boys that lived 2 stores down from us, 2 houses down from us. They had a canoe. And I could see them just rowing right by the back of the house. And that's how we lived for a few years. And then as my father put a foundation in, and they fixed this town brook or whatever they did, and we didn't have that anymore. But it was fun living downtown. We could walk to the movies, 10 cents every Saturday, 10 cents to see a show, walk to church. And I loved going to Hennessy's, which is not where it is now. I'd go downtown, go through the train station to get over on the other side. I'd go through the train station, and there'd be Eddie Long sitting on the other side with a bucket of forget-me-nots. Do you remember that, selling it? And then I'd go to Hennessy's, which was right there at the time. But now it just moved a couple. I saw some pictures recently of Hennessy's downtown where the dog shop is now, and I don't remember Hennessy's being there.
And also, you loved bowling, I understand. And there was a bowling
Yeah.
alley.
When I was 18, I decided to take up bowling, which was down near where the fruit center is now, down the harbor. I drank it, slept it, and did everything. I loved bowling. That was my favorite sport. But we didn't do too much. We had 3 cousins that lived on the same street, and we just get together at each other's houses and hear songs, latest songs, and just talk about our boyfriends. And there wasn't much going on, but it was wonderful going up downtown. I was there till I got married.
Yeah. And you were a young mother when your mom died, fairly young, only 52 years old. Must have been a very sad time for your dad.
It was.
But tell me about how the link that your mother had maintained all through the years with her friends at the Messina Orphanage brought renewed joy into the life of your family.
Well, my mother had all these, she called them sisters. They were all her sisters in the orphanage because they all grew up together. But there was one particular one called Carmela that she was very, very close to her. And after my mother died, when I was 28 years old when she died, my mom was 52. The woman of the orphanage, Sophia Edelson, asked Carmela to write a letter to my father to express her sympathy that her best friend had passed away. And she said, me? She said, I never had anything to do with a man before. They didn't have any relations with men in the orphanage. So she insisted. So she did write a letter. My father received a letter and responded. Next thing you know, they responded. And after 3 years, he decided to go over, and he knew her from seeing her in the orphanage. He ended up proposing to her. After 3 years, he went back to the orphanage. She's still in the orphanage. Now she's 49 years old. And Sophia didn't like the idea of her getting married because she was training Carmela to take over the orphanage because Sophia was getting old now. So as a result from that, when Camilla finally came over to America, which she ended up doing, there was no communication between Sophia and her. There was that bitterness that she had left the orphanage. She was sad. So after a while, she did forgive her. But she came here when my daughter Jeanette, who's sitting in the second row, was 3 months old. So Camilla comes into the house with my whole family, because in the meantime, my mother passed away. My husband and I and 2 children moved in with my dad, and 2 brothers who were in college. So it was a house full. So after Dad married Camilla, we called her Sia, because Sia means aunt in Italian. So after she comes to the house and this whole family she's meeting, she just took Jeanette as her own child, and she's been very, very close to Jeanette as a result. But she was like a second mother to me, because my mother would sing stories and sing songs that she had learned in the orphanage. Well, when Camilla came here, she was singing these very same songs that my mother used to sing to me. And she was wonderful. I had my mom 28 years, and I had Sia, Camilla, for 48 years. She died at 94 years old. Everyone downtown, the priest kissed her every time she'd come in. They called her the street sweeper. Every time you saw her, she was out front sweeping the sidewalk. I don't know, the neighbors can tell you that. She was wonderful, and she passed away, and the whole town just misses her. She's great.
What a lovely story. And when I first heard this story from Kay, and we actually did a StoryCorps recording together about her 2 mothers, I told this should be a movie. It's just so, it tells you so much about people going through these transitions, moving from one country to another, the importance of family, and even just the act of letter writing as a form of communication.
That's
how
right.
important
Yeah.
that
At
was
first, when Kamala
for
came
mom.
here,
Yeah.
she was writing, always sitting at the desk writing. Beautiful penmanship. Then later on, we all gave her gift certificates for telephone, and every Sunday, she would call her sister. She left sisters behind when she came here, which she missed terribly. And every Sunday, 6 o'clock in the morning, she would get up. It was 12 o'clock in Italy. It's a 6-hour difference. So she would call at 6 o'clock, and they were all waiting. All her sisters were waiting to receive this call. And she just loved it.
Thank you so much, Kay, for sharing that beautiful story. And now I want to ask the panel some questions about this broader community that they grew up in. Okay, first, manja, food. I'll just leave it at that. Marianne, tell us about the community's enjoyment of food and other related substances.
Well, food is life. It is our tradition to have particular foods at particular holidays. My dad had a huge garden, as did, I'm sure, many others, and the best of the produce was brought down to the bottom of the hill to be sold to people going by, especially to Nantasket Beach in the summer. It was brought to the church and the convent, always, and even today, when we start thinking about holidays, we have particular things that you have to have at every particular holiday, which I'm sure everyone does, in order for it to be the holiday. So it is the tradition and is very much a part of our community.
And everyone raised vegetables, obviously, but also chickens, and we heard a little bit about pigs being raised.
So stories were told by my mom, and luckily I missed out on this, but the pigs would run around and they would drain the blood out of the pig, right? And then make blood pudding, which was supposed to taste like chocolate pudding. I missed out on all of that. I was born after that. But that is what I understand. They used every single part of the animals. And then growing up in my dad's garden was huge. We would all sit around in the porch and shuck peas and clean beans and do whatever we had to do, and just to make sure that we could eat in the wintertime too, because it was preserved. So I didn't miss out on that. I preserved many a tomato in August, and we fried and froze things as time went on, so less boiling.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
Anyone
of
want
the
to talk
produce.
about the winemaking in the community?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about that. I'm going to pass that on.
So the winemaking, I can remember that was a big deal on the street. And it was always around, kind of like around this time of year, or maybe even a month earlier than now. But the men would all get together. They'd be down the basement. They had the press. They'd press the wine. And I remember it used to be measured out by the coffee cup full. So like half a coffee cup was like a standard dose. If you had a full coffee cup, you know, somebody was coming to get you to take you home, because it wasn't like the wine that you think of that you buy in the store, I can tell you that. So it had a little bit more of a kick to it. And even later on when the work got harder where they couldn't, and I remember the wild grapes being everywhere on Kilby Street, and we used to pick them by the 5-gallon buckets, and you could sell them to the older citizens, you know, and they'd give you money for them. And but as that got harder, they would send somebody into I think it was Everett on the other side of Boston, where you could buy it. It was like a wheel of cheese, but it was already pressed grapes, and then they would make wine out of that. Like somebody did all the work for you, and then they would put it together. And there's still people on Kilby Street making wine today. So.
And what about fishing? There's a lot of water in this
So
neighborhood.
so Foundry Pond was not like it is today. Unfortunately, it was full of smelt. I can remember going down there, same thing. Although illegal, we used to just simply, there was so many smelt there, you could dip a 5-gallon bucket in, pull it up, drain the water off, and bring it up, and you'd sell those. You could probably, we used to sell those for $1 a piece, and people would like literally fry them up right then. I mean, like the second they got them. And the smelts, they'd eat whole. They'd put them, dip them in a batter, they'd fry them, eat the whole thing. And there was so many of them, you could almost walk across the Ware River. Yeah.
So we're talking about food and celebrations that involve food. Some continue to this day. This is a picture from various Labor Day celebrations of the Feast of Madonna della Luz, which still goes on in the community in West Corner. And here's one from the Columbus Day Parade that used to take place. And we've heard a lot about Anna, who's in the picture over here in a peasant costume for the event. And Keith, could you tell us a little bit about what you remember from these celebrations?
Sure. So that area the quadrangle that you showed, I can remember as a kid, Sam Amonte, who had come home from the war, he was a war hero. He became a Hingham cop. And he used to walk a beat downtown here. He was called Smiling Sam. He would come with the horses, you know, the barricades. They would block off Kilby Street at 3A at where Sons of Italy is now, down Rockland Street, so block it there, all the way down to West Corner. And at the Grotto's Barbershop, they used to begin this parade every year. We had an actual parade. And it doesn't go on now, and unfortunately. And all the street vendors from like St. Anthony's Feast that everyone's pretty well familiar with in the North End that goes on, St. Geramo's Feast, they would be in the parking lot of Sons of Italy. It wasn't a square inch of room. And this parade would start, and my grandmother, my grandfather's truck, my Uncle Joe's truck, we would be on there. We would make costumes and be in it. And the two Lagrateria brothers there, I think they were from Cohasset, and they had that goose. So that goose was on a leash, and that goose would lead the parade. Yeah, and the goose's name was Simon because, again, being part of that community, we were fortunate to have the monks. So we had the abbey in our community, and those monks were the father was, one of the brothers there was Brother Simon. He'd take care of all the animals. So as kids, you'd walk through, if the river wasn't running, you'd walk across and you could go pet all the animals and talk to Brother Simon. And so they named that goose Simon. So that thing used to lead the parade. And then there was actual floats, and there's some of the guys there. Yeah, Frank Barbuto, and those guys those are some of the winemaking guys right there. And you can see probably, I think that one guy is drinking up top, Tony Mann. So that used to go on all the time. And I remember when that was a sad day when that ended, like when we knew we couldn't just block the street off anymore. Like the town had gotten bigger. There was actual ordinances against stuff like that. So that didn't happen anymore. But it was very, you can tell just from doing that, and they did that on their own. And like that feast today that you showed on the last slide still goes on, and it's very well attended. And every Labor Day. That used to be actually a 2-day event where they would carry the statue, and there was a mass, and it was all in Italian, and
They still have that.
they still have, yeah, it's all one day now, yeah. So, but it's still well attended, and people come down. It's part of a feast calendar that they share, and there's people that come down from the North Shore all the way down here to go to that.
So we're talking about this neighborhood, which has some unique geographic features. So this is a picture of Foundry Pond, right off Kilby Street. That's one of 23 places or structures in this neighborhood that are listed on Hingham's comprehensive inventory of historic assets. So a lot of the structures from the early 20th century are still there and are valued by the town as part of its history. But I'd like to hear members of the panel talk about what it was like to grow up in this very natural area. You had the Foundry Pond, you had the Weir River, the marshland there, lots of open space, and then this feeling of community where you could go anywhere. Talk about what life was like for the young people growing up in that environment.
Sure, I know, we used to measure the days in the summer by the high tides. So Rocco Calvi, who lived at the end of the street, had a lot of heavy equipment, and he cleared a beach there, and there was actual places to sit. There was sand. Where he got all this stuff, I have no idea. But when it was high tide, we would swim there, and it was a great place just to walk down. Hey, I'm going swimming. Although after the young man drowned on there, we were never allowed to skate on that pond. We never allowed to go out on the ice because it is a river. So the water underneath is moving, and that's how that young man died. Tragically, we used to go to Sidney's Pond, which was on the other side of the street, closer to Rockland Street, which it wasn't running as much. But like I said, we used to get the fish out of there, and it was just it was a grand time. To the right of this picture, I'm thinking, no, to the left actually, the Lane Quarry, which is still over there, was another place to investigate, and it's full of old stuff, and we used to just explore through there. And like I said, as long as you were staying in the neighborhood, when the street lights came on, it was time to come home. But if you were in the neighborhood, you were okay. Where were you? I was down West Corner, so you were all set. But
Well, I think one of the things that I remember is that no matter where you went, there were eyes on you everywhere. So as a kid, you knew that, someone was going to see anything that you were going to do, and it would get reported back. So we all kind of knew.
yeah.
And anyone could yell at you. Everyone was your aunt or your mom.
Aunt.
Yeah. So it was a very comfortable, safe feeling.
And Carl and Kay, you both grew up on North Street, but any thoughts to add?
I don't think North Street was like Kilby Street.
No.
Because they were really a family. I mean, the two people that I knew were Carl, Kelly, and myself. I mean, there wasn't anybody that we were really close to that we could say, we could go into that house and have dinner. Because it wasn't that way at all. We were all more or less to ourselves on North Street. It was a beautiful place to move up to live on, though. We grew up.
Carl, you could go visit family over in the neighborhood, though, right?
Well, yes, we would go to my grandmother's house and visit her. But, that was usually, as I mentioned earlier, on a Sunday afternoon or something like that. Our times around North Street were spent, we had a whole neighborhood there in West Hingham where there were stores and things, a drugstore at the corner, and Goodwin's Market down at the corner, and Howe's store right across the street from us, and Humphrey's Ice Pond where you could go skating. And so we had pretty much everything we needed right there. We didn't have to go far.
So thank you to our wonderful panelists. Well, thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience.